Howdy y'all, welcome back. Thank you for being here. Today, we're going to try to uncover a facet of history which, honestly, in the Western world, has not been talked about enough. For at the heart of this narrative is an entire culture that was seemingly compartmentalized, ostracized, and Americanized directly before the outbreak of the Industrial Revolution and the advent of photography. While this was not an uncommon practice among colonizing kingdoms, it is sometimes difficult to explain how the mass of quintessential revolutions throughout our timeline all appeared to be orchestrated around relatively the same time period. Furthermore, at the heart of the history of Hawaii lies ancient traditions which appeared to have been purposefully uprooted, yet the exact series of events is still very much up for debate, even among the so-called modern-day experts. It doesn't help that, following the passing of Kamehameha in 1819, the kingdom that he unified quickly fell into European control, quite literally destroying and erasing the societal structure that had been in place in these lands for hundreds of years. It's as if the Hawaiian Islands were unified for an ulterior purpose, which becomes even more clear when we understand that most of the ancient architecture of Hawaii was ordered to be destroyed directly after Kamehameha's passing. The origin of the lost architecture and its purpose is equally as mystifying, as many of these structures have been built in stone, seemingly indicating an advanced ability of their constructors. Yet many ancient Hawaiian traditions equate these creations with legends lost, sometimes in mythical groups. Even the life of Kamehameha is up for a fair amount of debate, as many details of his early life are not set in stone, excuse my pun, and they have a wide array of interpretations. His birthday, for example, ranges from the earliest possible given in 1736 to him possibly being born as late as 1761. Some oral tradition states Kamehameha was born in 1758, during the time of Halley's Comet. Still, others suggest that the man who would become the king of all Hawaii already had children by 1760, making the 1736 birth date likely more accurate. Even Kamehameha's exact origins in this narrative are also unknown, as some say he was adopted into the royal court, while others say he had a direct blood tie to the kingship. Either way, we're told he was raised by his uncle among the royalty, and upon his uncle's passing, Kamehameha was given the most prominent religious position in all of Hawaii, as the guardian of the Hawaiian war god, Kuku Ilamoku. Some versions postulate Kamehameha started making sacrifices to the gods by himself in lieu of the king, a direct act of disobedience. Others claim that Kamehameha was aware of an ancient prophecy regarding the Naha Stone, and he was able to move the stone. The Naha Stone is considered to be a large, naturally occurring, volcanic rock in the shape of a pillar or obelisk. However, history states when the Naha Stone was first discovered on the island of Kauai, it was immediately believed to be a sign from the gods, with the obelisk-shaped stone serving as the symbol of Hawaiian royalty. Kamehameha was said to have, around the age of 14, been able to lift or move the Naha Stone by himself, fulfilling the prophecy, with the stone estimated to weigh between 2.5 and 3.5 tons. Whether he somehow did this by hand, which may make us think of the giants of old, the Nephilim, and other extremely large figures of mythology, or if he was using cutting-edge techniques of the time that his leading engineers had introduced him to, we are told after moving the Naha Stone, many chiefs within the Hawaiian Islands still refused to respect the prophecy. They ignored Kamehameha's claim to the throne, and in some instances, they even declared war on him. However, the Kona chiefs, who worshipped the stone and honored the ancient tradition, gave Kamehameha their full allegiance, which he used to capture, fortify, and unify the islands of Hawaii. However, this narrative also indicates that in some ways, the High Court of Hawaii and the land of New Zealand were still directly tied together, as the alleged Naha Stone prophecy claimed that New Zealand was among the land to be unified by Kamehameha. Again, this is all the current narrative, so we know we can't exactly pinpoint any of these details as completely accurate, as even in this narrative, it says most of the evidence is circumstantial. But following Kamehameha's lifting of the Naha Stone, he then began to engage with merchants, both British and American. Those from the Butterworth Squadron guaranteed Hawaii open trade with their lands and mainland China, and this began in 1791. And these same British merchants were said to have taught Kamehameha the gunpowder formula. Again, I don't want to wax too much into any one facet of this history, but we're also told at one time one of Kamehameha's leading adversaries fortified a mountain, the Nuuanu Pali, hollowing out portions of the inside of the mountain to form a castle-like defensive structure with a turret location for the cannons which he had acquired. We're told Kamehameha and his men then scaled the mountain of his foe, capturing it before forcing all the rebelling party to jump from the cliffs, over 1,000 feet. By 1795, the last island out of Kamehameha's control was the powerful and mythical Kauai. Yet by 1800, Kamehameha was said to have been unable to pierce Kauai's defenses. He steadily gathered troops and weaponry through 1803, a full 8 years of preparation. And that was when bubonic plague or cholera was said to have broken out on the Hawaiian Islands. Not only did this diminish Kamehameha's troops significantly, but we're actually told this epidemic ended up benefiting Kamehameha. While he did contract the disease himself, he survived. The leaders of Kauai were not so lucky. Through what are said to be natural means, the lineage of Kauai's rulers progressed on, and the new leaders vowed to make peace with Kamehameha without war. That's an interesting tidbit. Rather uneventfully, according to the current narrative, the Hawaiian Islands, previously known as the Sandwich Islands, were finally unified for the first time in recorded history. The high priest of all of Hawaii, in charge of all the religious practices, then became Kaluku Ahulu, Kamehameha's court genealogist. Kamehameha was said to have adopted numerous policies, which then ensured that his unified kingdom stayed powerful upon his passing. He enacted taxes on all of his people, using the goods that he gathered as tax to sell back to European merchants. He also unified the legal system, known as the Law of the Splintered Oar, which he had drafted in 1797. According to the narrative, the Law of the Splintered Oar is where the saying, "women and children" comes from, in reference to innocents and those who should be spared or saved first. Apparently, before 1797 and Hawaii, it was somewhat commonplace worldwide for attacking or invading parties to often attack everyone, including women and children. While on a military campaign in Puna in the early 1780s, Kamehameha was pillaging a small fishing village when his leg was trapped between two large rocks. Here, the fishermen, who had just witnessed him brutalize the innocent people of the village, knocked Kamehameha unconscious, but they spared his life. Upon his ascendancy to the throne, we're told those same two fishermen, who had become infamous in Hawaii, were brought before King Kamehameha in 1797. Instead of sacrificing or punishing the men, Kamehameha was said to have spared them, giving them each a tract of land. Let every elderly person, woman, and child live by the roadside in safety. That was the gist of his new law, meaning civilians and non-war combatants could no longer legally be attacked during a conquest. Apparently, this law became so radical yet so peaceful that it garnered worldwide attention and became one of the bases for human rights laws moving forward. However, We also have other key facets of the history which don't exactly add up, and much of this actually led me to believe there's more below the surface regarding the true history of Hawaii. For one, following Kamehameha's passing in 1819, the Anoa was enacted. This was a common practice after the passing of a leader, where certain restrictions were lifted and taboos were broken within the Hawaiian religion and social hierarchy. For within this system, great importance was placed on the adherence to ancient principles, with those who broke these traditions being cast out of society or worse. Yet, following the passing of a great leader, these restrictions were temporarily lifted until a new leader was instated. These restrictions, or taboos, were known as kapu, and the Hawaiian term kapu is actually where the English term taboo comes from. The next part will surely leave some of you questioning this entire narrative. In 1819, Kamehameha's son, Kamehameha II, rose to power following his father's passing. However, the unified Hawaiian kingdom was in such deep mourning that when Kamehameha II attempted to re-establish the kapu, the Hawaiians rebelled and resisted. His mother, the wife to Kamehameha I, as well as most of the first king's other wives, all rebelled, and they all refused to respect the kapu. Then, the religious chief of all of Hawaii at that time, Hiwa, also refused to respect the kapu. Kamehameha II was ostensibly exiled from Hawaii, where he set sail for 2 days in the royal canoe, before landing back on the Big Island and participating in the feverishly religious Feast of the Dog Meat, which for centuries was limited to participation strictly by women. This breaking of one of Hawaii's most sacred and ancient taboos thus marked the complete destruction of the Hawaiian religion, which disappeared out of practice on the islands almost immediately. Furthermore, this destruction of the Hawaiian religion also was said to have encompassed the full-scale destruction of many of the ancient religious sites throughout the islands. Of note here is that, through the time of Kamehameha, religious practices as well as meetings of the ruling elite were often held at sites called heiau, which means fortified temple. These temples were off limits to the public and could only be accessed by priests and chiefs, who used the temples as chambers for making sacrifice and decision-making. We're told from Kamehameha's passing in 1819 and the beginning of the taboo period, it took less than 1 year for Christian missionaries to colonize the islands, with most chiefs immediately converting. The full-fledged destruction of the ancient temples, or heiau, was said to have been completed by roughly 1830, when the original Hawaiian religion was made illegal. However, oral tradition of the ancient Hawaiian belief system persisted, and according to widespread legend, it was the Menehune who constructed and built out the lavish structures of ancient Hawaii. The Menehune are described as a miniature race of humanoid creatures who once occupied all of Hawaii before the arrival of the first Polynesians around 500 AD. Although some scholars claim the Polynesians arrived much earlier, and others claim they arrived much later. It all depends on who you ask. The Polynesian leaders, known as the Kahuna, traced their bloodlines back to the gods, and these Polynesians believed the Menehune, or little humans, were created by the gods to essentially terraform the Hawaiian Islands. However, the true history is equally as strange. We're told the Kingdom of Hawaii remained unified from 1795 through 1893, although the last of the islands to comply was Kauai in 1810. Kauai also just so happened to be the first of the islands encountered by Europeans in 1778. However, for 250 years, beginning in 1565, Spanish ships had a known passage from what is today Mexico to the Philippines, and this route would have surely taken them past the Hawaiian Islands. Further adding to this, in 1589, the first published map of the Pacific was created by Abraham Ortelius. However, this map was based off an earlier map by Franz Hogenberg, which itself was influenced by a 1568 map and description of Japan by the Portuguese. These maps appeared to all include the Hawaiian Islands, labeling them as the volcanoes. However, it's James Cook's exploration, roughly 200 years later, which is credited with the first landing of a European on the Hawaiian Islands, at Kauai. Unlike many of the religious sites across the islands, which were built of wood and earthworks, Kauai was said to have been a home to a series of massive temples built out of stone, all of which had an oral tradition of being founded by the Menehune and predating Polynesian occupation of the island. When the Hawaiian religion fell in 1819 and the temples were all destroyed, it was the stone temples of Kauai which, due to their intricate construction, appeared to be able to survive a brunt of this demolition. Examples include the Aukoko fish pond, which contains a 900-foot-long retaining wall that holds back the adjacent river. We also have irrigation systems like the Menehune Ditch, which appeared to stretch across long parts of the island, interconnecting the towns and settlements. We also have the massive stone city of Ulupo Heiau, which once contained massive fortified walls, a large stone tower, and a 140-foot by 180-foot stone platform and temple for ceremonies, with an intricate irrigation system contained within to supply large farms within the structure. Kamehameha lived in the stone fortress of Ulupo Heiau in 1795, frequently revisiting the site as often as he could. Following European occupation, this specific site became one of the largest sugarcane plantations in all of the world. Yet the history of Kauai following European occupation is equally as unexplainable as it is frustrating. Around 1817, a Russian star fort was founded on Kauai, known as Fort St. Elizabeth, which was meant as a way for Russians to control trade and therefore control the island of Kauai, in agreement with the high chief at that time. The star fort was used until 1864, when it was promptly demolished. Yet what else was being covered over in Hawaii in 1864? As we're told, Heiau, the seventh largest of the Hawaiian Islands, was sold to the Sinclair family of Scotland in 1864, who still own and operate the island to this day. What's furthermore, nowhere in the main narrative I read of the Hawaiian conquest was Heiau mentioned, yet just like Kauai, Heiau also refused to unify with the other islands of Hawaii. Even when Kauai agreed to unify in 1810, considered to be the full unification of Hawaii, Heiau still resisted, and upon Kamehameha's passing in 1819, Heiau was the first island to try to reclaim independence. The Sinclair family, led by matriarch Elizabeth McHutchinson Sinclair, offered King Kamehameha V $10,000 in gold bars, equivalent to nearly $2 million today, to purchase the island, which was chosen over Waikiki and Pearl Harbor, both of which were also made available for purchase to the Sinclairs. It gets weirder though. The Sinclairs and their descendants, the Robinsons, continued to rule over Heiau with an iron fist. For example, by 1875, a factory was founded on the island by the Sinclairs, which began producing sleeping mats, the equivalent to mattresses, which became world-renowned. Yet the island only contained 350 people at this time, being the Sinclair family, and the rest were natives, as well as over 20,000 sheep. By 1900, the island was considered the least developed of the occupiable Hawaiian Islands, and by 1915, the Sinclair Robinsons closed the island to visitors completely, making it 100% private. You'd think, with all the changes in society over the last 100 plus years, that things would have shifted in Heiau, but quite the contrary. The Sinclair Robinsons continue to own the island, and the island has a ban on many modern products. There is no electricity for the natives. The inhabitants of the island are legally barred from discussing the island in public. If a native of the island leaves, they are not allowed to return to the island. And men on the island are required by law to keep their hair at shoulder length or above and to not grow facial hair. How this continues to occur in society in 2025 is beyond me. By 1893, the McKinley Act had ravaged Hawaii's exports and industry, allowing sugarcane to be imported from other parts of the world to America duty-free. A new constitution for the Kingdom of Hawaii was drafted to try to combat this. However, the ruling cabinet of Hawaii by this time was mostly made of people of European descent, with ties back to American trade. They resisted the new constitution, which led to an overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, which was said to have been spearheaded by Christian missionaries and backed by the American government through military support. By 1898, Hawaii was annexed by the United States under new President McKinley, the same man who had earlier forced Hawaii to try to form a new constitution through his acts that ravaged their economy. At that point, the true history of the Kingdom of Hawaii becomes hidden behind layers of American colonization and propaganda, with the true nature of what actually occurred only being able to be deduced from trying to examine the parts of a much larger, much more convoluted history. And even then, do we truly have an explanation for the architecture that was said to once litter the islands, lost and subdued through years of overgrowth, mismanagement, and the true rewriting of the history, which appears to have purposefully taken place?